All right, so let's dive into something pretty interesting. We're going to start with a scenario. Okay, imagine this, right? Your son, he goes and steals a sheep. In the Analects, we see this community where, like, everyone expects the father and son to protect each other, even in a case like that, right? But then you've got Socrates running into Euthyphro, and Euthyphro is, like, on his way to actually prosecute his dad for murder.
Yeah, and that kicks off this whole philosophical exploration into what piety actually is.
Right.
Yeah.
Total opposite responses. Like, on the one hand, you've got this immediate, practical, family-centered response in the Chinese example. And then you've got this, like, abstract, theoretical line of questioning coming out of the Greek tradition.
Exactly. And that right there, that difference highlights this really key characteristic of Chinese ethics.
Which
It's
is?
rooted in the real world. It's grounded in the lived experience.
It's not some ivory tower philosophy.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's about how you actually live your life, how you navigate the complexities of family and society.
And that's what we're going to explore in this deep dive. We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Chinese ethics as our guide.
Our map, if you will.
Love that. So think of it this way. We're going on this journey to uncover centuries of wisdom about living well, figuring out how to balance obligations to family and society, what drives our moral choices, and how to engage with the political landscape.
And for anyone with a philosophical mindset, this is a golden opportunity
To what?
to wrestle with some of the most fundamental ethical questions, but through a totally different lens.
Through a different cultural and philosophical tradition, you mean?
Precisely, a tradition that's just as rich, just as profound as any other.
Right. And our sources for this deep dive are pretty diverse. We're talking Confucianism, Mohism, Taoism, legalism, and even Chinese Buddhism.
A real smorgasbord of ethical thought.
But for this deep dive, our main focus is going to be on those first four.
Those indigenous schools that came out of the classical period.
That's right, the 6th to the 3rd century BCE.
An incredibly fertile period in Chinese intellectual history. And what makes it especially fascinating for a philosopher is that these weren't just theoretical exercises.
What do you mean?
These ideas, these schools of thought, they emerged as direct responses to the chaos and upheaval of that time. It was a period of intense political and social change.
So they were trying to find a way to create a better world.
Absolutely. A more harmonious, a more flourishing society.
Okay, so here's the mission for today.
Our guiding purpose.
We're going to extract those key ethical concepts and frameworks from this treasure trove of thought. And we're going to do it in a way that makes you think, makes you question, makes you see things from a new perspective.
Especially for someone who loves to dig into the nuances of philosophy.
Right. And what makes this especially interesting, I think, is that these ethical ideas are deeply rooted in pre-theoretical experience.
It's ethics that comes out of grappling with real-life situations.
Not just abstract principles.
Exactly. It's bottom-up rather than top-down.
Okay, so let's jump into Confucian ethics. Now, a lot of people will call Confucianism a virtue ethic, right? But for those of us who come from a Western philosophy background, we have to be careful with that label.
Because
Because virtue ethics in Western philosophy usually means you're putting character traits above rules or consequences when you're thinking about what's right and wrong. And in a broad sense, yeah, Confucianism does focus on cultivating certain qualities.
it's about what makes a good person, the ideal person, the Gen Z.
Right, but slapping on that virtue ethics label can be kind of misleading, especially if we're thinking about it the way Western philosophy debates it.
The classical Confucian texts don't really get into those same theoretical arguments that define virtue ethics as its own school of thought in Western philosophy.
You're saying they don't say outright that good character is more important than, say, following rules or getting good outcomes.
Exactly. They're not trying to create a systematic theory of ethics in that same way.
And some modern scholars have even pushed back against calling it virtue ethics at all.
Ames and Neville, for instance, have argued pretty strongly against that label.
Well, what's their take on it?
They say it's because the very term virtue comes loaded with certain Western philosophical baggage.
Like what?
Like the idea that virtues are these individual atomistic traits separate from everything else and that they apply in every situation no matter what.
I see their point.
But the Confucian understanding of virtue is totally different. It's all about relationships. It's not about developing Ren or line in a vacuum, right? You cultivate these virtues through your interactions with your parents, your kids, your community.
It's about being a good son, a good father, and good neighbor.
Exactly, within those specific relationships.
Which takes us to those core Confucian concepts. Tao the way, the path of ethical conduct, and Junzi, that exemplary person we were just talking about, and Ren. Let's start with Ren. Before Confucius came along, Ren was mostly about aristocratic status, right? Like having a noble bearing.
A mark of high social standing.
But Confucius flipped the script. He transformed it into this idea of moral excellence.
An excellence that, in theory at least, anyone could achieve through dedicated self-cultivation.
So it went from a quality you were born with to something you worked towards.
Precisely. And that shift from ascribed status to achieved moral worth is hugely significant.
Okay, so how do we understand Ren? Because I see it translated as benevolence, goodness, humaneness.
And that's part of what makes it so fascinating to a philosopher. It's this multifaceted concept.
Multifaceted in what way?
Well, on one hand, it seems like it's the ultimate virtue, the pinnacle of moral excellence. It's almost like being the Junzi, that ideal person striving for perfection. But on the other hand, it can also be just one virtue among others, alongside things like wisdom and righteousness.
Yeah, and then you have passages in the Analects, like 12.22, where it's defined very specifically as to love others.
Exactly. It's like the meaning is intentionally fluid, almost like it resists being pinned down to a single definition.
It's not just about memorizing a definition, right? You have to see it in action, see how it plays out in different situations.
Absolutely. And that, I think, reflects the Confucian emphasis on learning. By doing, by observing, by reflecting on actual examples.
Exemplarism, as some scholars call it.
Precisely. You learn by studying the lives of moral exemplars, figures from history like the sage kings or even Confucius himself.
It's about understanding what made those people exemplary and then striving to emulate them.
Engaging with their stories, their actions, and allowing those examples to shape your own character.
Yeah, like in Book 10 of the Analects, where it describes Confucius's daily life in such detail, how he dressed, how he interacted with people.
It seems almost excessive at first glance.
But if you see it as a way of showing his students what virtue looks like in practice,
Then it starts to make a lot of sense.
it's like, here's your model. Observe, internalize, emulate.
And that focus on the details of daily life, that's a really crucial aspect of Confucian ethics.
It's not just about those big hypothetical dilemmas that philosophers love to debate.
It's about the ethics of everyday living, the tiny interactions that make up a life.
Right. So let's move on to Li, often translated as ritual propriety or rites. And this is a huge one in Confucianism.
Absolutely central to the whole project of ethical cultivation.
And it really sets Confucianism apart from, say, Aristotle's idea of how you build good habits.
For the Confucians, Li is not just about repeating actions until they become automatic.
It's not mindless repetition.
Not at all. It's about consciously and deliberately performing these culturally established customs, these rituals that show respect, deference, proper conduct in different social situations.
So it's like a bridge between personal self-cultivation and maintaining social order.
Exactly. It operates on both levels. You cultivate yourself through ritual, and at the same time, you participate in the rituals that hold society together.
Now, the exact role of Li in self-cultivation, especially how it relates to Ren, is something scholars debate.
There are different interpretations.
Like in Analects 3.3, it asks, a man who is not Ren, what has he to do with ritual?
Right, which implies that ritual is only meaningful if you already have some degree of Ren.
That Li is just a tool to express and cultivate that deeper quality.
Exactly. That's often attributed to the sage King Shun. It's the instrumental view of Li, like it's a means to an end.
And you can see this view playing out in other passages, like Analects 9.3, where Confucius doesn't really care what a silk cap is made of.
But he insists on performing the traditional bow before going up to the ruler's platform.
So it's the attitude, the inner disposition that matters most.
But then you have a philosopher like Fingeret who takes a totally different stance.
Which is?
He says, Li, the ritual itself is an end in itself. It's not just a means to get to Ren, it's a valuable part of what makes a human life complete and meaningful.
So performing the rituals, participating in these shared customs, that's part of living a good life.
Precisely, and it highlights this often overlooked aspect of Confucian ethics.
Which is?
The aesthetic dimension. It's not just about being morally good, it's about living a life that has a certain beauty, a grace that comes from these harmonious interactions.
Okay, so we've got this dynamic, intertwined relationship between Ren and Li.
And it shows how Confucianism thinks about morality in a very different way.
It's not just abstract principles. It's embedded in these cultural practices and how we live our lives in relation to others.
Some contemporary philosophers in the West, Those with communitarian leanings have found this aspect of Confucianism very appealing. Thinkers like MacIntyre and Walser, for instance.
Yeah, they emphasize how moral values are often shaped by the specific customs and traditions of a society.
Right, and that raises this really interesting question for a philosopher.
Which is?
How do those culturally specific norms and practices relate to those deeper, maybe more universal ethical values? The Analects clearly shows how important culture is, but it doesn't say that culture is the only thing that determines what's right and wrong.
So there's room for philosophical debate. And we can't forget that aesthetic element, right? For Confucians, a truly good life isn't just morally upright. It has this elegance, this beauty that arises from interacting with others in these established, respectful ways.
It's like a perfectly choreographed dance, as Ihara describes it.
And that beauty, that harmony, it's valuable in its own right.
It adds another layer of meaning to human flourishing.
Right. Which challenges some of those purely rational approaches to ethics, those that try to separate the moral from the aesthetic.
It forces us to consider whether those approaches are missing something crucial about human experience.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about this idea of relational values versus individual autonomy. We already touched on it with Ren being about caring for others and Lai being about interacting with others in these meaningful ways.
Right, those are core relational values in Confucianism.
And it often leads to comparisons with Western ethics, which tends to prioritize individual autonomy, the freedom to choose your own path.
That's a common point of contrast.
But autonomy is a complex idea.
It has multiple layers.
Like,
Well, you have the idea of putting individual interests above the group's interests, right?
right.
And then you have the freedom to choose from all these different lifestyles and the idea that you should live according to your own moral understanding.
Right. And Confucianism does acknowledge that third sense of autonomy, in a way.
The importance of following your own conscience, your own sense of what's right.
Like Confucius talks about cultivating your own moral integrity, even if others don't get it.
And Mencius and Zunzi both argue that you have a duty to speak truth to power, to challenge a ruler who is acting unjustly.
But that doesn't necessarily mean you have a right to criticize those in power without consequence.
Right. And in terms of having all these different choices of how to live your life, that's not really a Confucian idea.
They're more about following the Tao, a single path to flourishing.
Exactly, a defined way of life.
And when it comes to individual versus group interests, it's not like Confucians think you should just sacrifice yourself for the group.
It's not about subordination.
It's more like this idea of mutual dependence, reciprocal responsibilities.
Everyone is connected, and the well-being of the individual is tied to the well-being of the group.
Like the story of Shun marrying without his father's permission.
Right. It wasn't about rebelling against his family. It was about preserving a crucial relationship.
That ultimately benefited everyone involved.
Exactly. It's about understanding that individual and group interests are often intertwined.
And that brings us to the idea of harmony, often translated as he.
A concept that's often misunderstood.
Yeah, a lot of people think it just means everyone agreeing.
But it's so much more nuanced than that. Like in Analects 13.23, Confucius says, the Junzi seeks harmony, not sameness.
So it's not about everyone being the same.
Not at all. A good analogy is Yan Ying soup.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this soup.
Yan Ying was a famous statesman, and he said, to make a truly delicious soup, you need all these different ingredients.
Each with its own unique flavor.
Exactly. And it's the combination of those flavors, the balance, that makes the soup so good.
So harmony is about bringing together different perspectives, different viewpoints, and finding that balance.
Reconciling differences, not erasing them.
And it's not like this state of harmony is easy to achieve or maintain, right?
No, not at all.
Confucianism is very aware of how much we crave connection, but also how fragile those connections can be.
Right. You can cultivate lie, you can develop respectful dispositions.
But loss, conflict, disagreement, those are inevitable parts of life.
And losing those crucial connections can really shake your sense of who you are.
And then you have contemporary scholars like Ng, who are looking at how Confucianism grapples with that vulnerability.
And how do you hold on to your sense of self, your relational identity, when those relationships are broken?
It's a really interesting angle.
Especially when you compare it to Western ethical systems that often focus on the individual as being self-sufficient, resilient, able to bounce back from anything.
Okay, let's talk about another huge theme in Confucianism. Filiality.
The importance of family.
Absolutely central, and you see it everywhere in the Analects. Not wanting your parents to worry, making sure they have what they need, even being mindful of your facial expressions around them.
It's all about respect and deference.
But here's a question that comes up for me, especially as someone coming from a philosophical background. Does Confucianism say you have to obey your parents no matter what?
That's a crucial question. It's a complex issue.
What if you think they're wrong about something?
Well, the Analects itself doesn't give a simple, straightforward answer. Like in 2.5, Confucius says, do not disobey.
So that sounds pretty absolute.
But the context there is specifically about funeral rites and mourning rituals. And in 4.1 Teat, he suggests gently remonstrating with your parents if you think they're wrong.
So there's some wiggle room.
Right. And other Confucian texts have their own takes on it. The Record of Ritual, for instance, leans more towards obedience if respectful persuasion fails. But then you have Zunzi, who argues that moral righteousness trumps parental wishes in certain cases.
Interesting. So even within Confucianism, there are different perspectives on this.
Which makes sense, right? It's about trying to balance these deeply held values, filial piety and moral righteousness.
And that takes us to the whole issue of conflicting loyalties. Like, what happens when your duty to your parents clashes with your duty to your ruler or with justice in general?
Right, like in Analects 13.1, where the father and son cover up each other's crimes.
Clearly prioritizing family in that case.
And that example ties into the Confucian idea of care with distinctions.
Yeah.
You owe moral consideration to all people, but the intensity of that obligation depends on your relationship with them.
Closer relationships mean stronger obligations.
Exactly.
So Jiang argues that this tension between care for those close to you and these more impartial values like justice is a driving force behind a lot of the ethical debates in Chinese philosophy.
And the Confucians have different ways of dealing with that tension. Well, some, the extensionists, believe you can ultimately harmonize those seemingly conflating values. Others, the sacrificialists, say you have to prioritize those relationships closest to you when push comes to shove.
So it's a matter of which value you prioritize in a conflict.
Exactly.
And then you have Mencius, who jumps right into this debate with his defense of care with distinctions. He's going up against the Mohists, who advocate for Jian-A.
Which is often understood as impartial or universal care.
Right. But Mencius pushes back. He appeals to our natural instinct to care for those closest to us. He asks the Mohist, Yizi, do you really believe you should love your nephew no more than your neighbor's baby?
It's a powerful rhetorical question.
Highlighting the naturalness and moral importance of family bonds.
And Mencius uses a very interesting method of moral reasoning in these discussions.
Tell me more about that.
He uses analogies. When you're faced with a tough ethical dilemma, you look back at past situations where you made a decision you felt good about, and you use those past cases as your guide, your exemplars.
So you're comparing the new situation to those past examples.
Exactly. Looking for similarities and differences to help you make the best decision.
Interesting. And you see this playing out in the stories about Shen, who faced all these difficult conflicts between his duty to his family and his duty to society.
His actions become a model, an exemplar for how to navigate those complex situations.
So you're not just applying abstract principles, you're drawing on these concrete examples.
It's a very different way of approaching ethical reasoning.
Now, we can't talk about Confucianism without talking about the big debate between Mencius and Zunzi.
The debate about human nature.
Right. Mencius is famous for arguing that human nature is inherently good.
That we have these four beginnings, these seeds of virtue inside of us.
And if those seeds are nurtured, they'll naturally grow into full-blown moral virtues.
Like plants reaching for the sunlight.
But Zunzi, he totally disagrees. He says human nature is inherently bad. We're driven by self-interest and desires, and if we're left unchecked, we'll just descend into chaos.
He believed that morality doesn't come naturally to us. It has to be cultivated.
Through conscious effort, learning, and rituals, right?
Exactly. He uses these analogies of shaping crooked wood or a potter molding clay.
The sages are the ones who created those rituals and standards of conduct that help us overcome our flawed nature.
It's a very different image from Mencius's sprouting seeds.
So on one hand, you have Mencius saying, we have this inherent potential for goodness, and all we need is the right environment to flourish.
And on the other hand, you have Zunzi saying we're fundamentally flawed and we need external guidance and discipline to become moral.
It's a pretty stark contrast.
It really gets to the heart of some core philosophical questions about morality.
Like, where does it come from?
And what motivates us to be good?
This debate even touches on the whole moral realism versus moral constructivism thing.
Right. Mencius, with his idea of these heaven-endowed moral beginnings, he could be seen as leaning toward moral realism.
The idea that moral values exist objectively, independent of human opinion.
Exactly. Whereas Sunzi, who says the sages created morality to ensure social harmony, he seems more like a constructivist.
Morality is a human invention.
Right. But even those labels can be a bit too simplistic.
How so?
Well, some interpretations of Zunzi suggest that Tian, heaven, might have given humans the tools to overcome social conflict.
So it's not purely a human creation.
Maybe not. And then you have interpretations of Mencius that downplay the role of a transcendent heaven in his thought.
Emphasizing more our own human agency in developing morality.
Exactly. It shows how these debates are never really black and white.
And then there's Zunzi's theory of moral motivation, which is pretty interesting.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the most thought-provoking parts of his philosophy.
He argues that people can actually learn to love virtue for its own sake, not just because they want rewards or fear punishment.
How exactly does that happen? How do you go from being motivated by self-interest to genuinely loving what's good?
Right, that's a key question.
He suggests that the intellect can override those baser desires.
But the exact mechanism for that transformation, it's not entirely clear.
But he does hint that compassion might play a role. That natural empathy we feel for others could be a starting point for developing a genuine love of virtue.
So this whole debate between Mencius and Zunzi, it really gives us a lot to chew on.
Fundamental questions about human nature, moral knowledge, what drives us to do good. It's fascinating stuff.
Okay, let's bring things into a more modern context. Let's talk about the situation as challenge to virtue ethics.
A challenge coming from social psychology research.
Right. The basic idea is that our behavior is more influenced by the situation we're in than by these stable character traits.
It's a pretty big challenge to virtue ethics in general.
So how does Confucianism, which is often seen as a virtue ethic, how does it respond to that?
Well, it's got a few tools in its arsenal.
Like,
Well, it already acknowledges the importance of context, of relationships, and it sees virtues not as fleeting things, but as deeply ingrained dispositions.
so it's not like you can just flip a switch and become virtuous, right?
Not at all. It's a long process of cultivation.
And Confucians also emphasize the need to develop your own independent moral understanding.
To think critically, to reflect on your actions and motivations.
And it's all very practical, right? Focused on actually living a good life, not just theorizing about it.
Exactly.
But probably the most important response is the emphasis on ethical training.
Right. This is not just about knowing the rules, it's about internalizing them, making them part of who you are.
And how do you do that?
Through study, memorization, ritual practice. It's a long and demanding process.
Slingerland talks about how the Confucians set a very high bar for what kind of situational influence can sway you.
Because they're trying to embed these ethical dispositions so deeply that they become almost second nature.
You're less likely to be swayed by immediate pressures if you've internalized those virtues.
And it's not just mindless repetition either. Mencius talks about consciously nourishing those moral sprouts.
Reflecting on your actions, being aware of your emotions.
It's about actively shaping those inner tendencies that lead to virtuous action.
It's interesting how that connects with what modern psychology is finding about self-control and things like compassion meditation.
Yeah, it's about training your mind, developing those mental habits that support ethical behavior.
And remember, both Confucius and Mencius saw a lack of virtue, not just as an individual failing, but as a societal problem.
If people are struggling to survive, they're not going to have much mental space for moral development.
Right, they need that basic material security to really flourish.
And they need supportive social structures.
So it's not just about individual effort, it's about creating the right environment.
Exactly. And that's something that's often overlooked in those situationist experiments that focus on the individual in isolation.
Okay, let's talk about responsibility and agency in Confucianism.
It's a unique perspective.
I see Confucian ethics as fundamentally a responsibility ethic. It's about how we respond to the needs of others, to our obligations within those relationships.
You're responsible for how you show up in those relationships.
And all those core virtues, ren, yi, li, filiality, they're all about being a good responder.
A reliable, trustworthy person that others can count on.
Right. Someone who takes his obligations seriously.
And that emphasis on interconnectedness leads to a very different understanding of responsibility.
How so?
Well, think about exemplary officials in Confucianism. They're expected to be incredibly responsive to the needs of the people they govern. Like, Mencius describes Yuan-Ji, these legendary figures, as being so devoted to public service that they neglected their own families.
Wow, that's a high bar.
It is. And even Sunzi, who had a less rosy view of human nature, he still believed that rulers exist for the sake of the people.
Their primary duty is to serve.
Exactly.
And Mencius, he even got into policy recommendations.
Right. He argued for things like fair taxation and responsible resource management because he thought those were essential for creating a society where people could actually develop morally.
Like, people need their basic needs met to focus on anything else.
Exactly. If you're constantly worried about survival, your mind is not going to be on higher things.
That reminds me of Nagel's concept of circumstantial luck. The idea that your external circumstances have a huge impact on your life, on your moral development.
And it's not just about luck either. Those in positions of power have a responsibility to create the conditions that allow for moral flourishing.
Right. And Zunzi, even though he was more pessimistic about human nature, he still believed that we have a collective responsibility to help each other become better people.
Like Confucius serving as Minister of Justice, right? He used his position to educate people, to improve their lives.
So agency is not just about the individual making choices. It's also about shaping the environment in which those choices are made.
It's a shared responsibility.
But individuals still have to do their part,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. You have to exercise your heart-mind, your moral compass, when the opportunity arises. And that involves self-reflection, like Mencius talks about reflecting on those initial moral impulses, and Zunzi talks about reflecting on how to satisfy your desires in a way that's consistent with ritual propriety.
And all of this ties into the Confucian idea of a meritocratic society, right? Where those who have cultivated the most virtue are the ones best suited to lead.
Exactly. And that notion of distributed agency, that's a really rich concept for philosophers to explore.
Because it shows how interconnected we are, how our actions influence each other, how those in power can shape the moral landscape.
Okay, let's talk about Neo-Confucianism, which came later. Key figures here are Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming.
They basically took those classical Confucian ideas and reinterpreted them, added some new layers, incorporated influences from Buddhism and Taoism.
Zhu Xi played a huge role in establishing the Confucian canon, and he really emphasized Mencius's idea of inherent goodness.
He thought we all have this innate goodness, and it'll naturally unfold if we don't mess it up.
Exactly. He developed a whole system of metaphysics to explain this, with concepts like Lie principle or pattern and key material force or energy.
So Li is like the underlying order of the universe, and Qi is the stuff that things are made of.
That's a simplified way to put it, but yes. And while there's debate about how exactly Lie and Qi interact, Zhu Xi's framework helped explain both the moral order of the universe and why people develop differently morally.
Some people are just born with better Qi.
Or they face different circumstances that hinder their moral development.
Okay, and Wang Yangming.
He took a different approach. He emphasized internal understanding over external investigation.
So it's not about studying the classics, it's about looking inward.
Exactly. He said the mind itself is Li, meaning that the capacity for moral judgment is already within us.
So we don't need to learn morality from outside sources.
Not according to Wang Yangming. He thought the path to goodness was about clearing away those selfish desires that cloud the mind.
So evil is like ignorance, a lack of clear understanding.
In a sense, yes. It's about those selfish desires distorting our innate moral sense.
Interesting. So while they had different approaches, both Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming valued this idea of spontaneous ethical action.
Doing the right thing effortlessly, naturally, because you just know it's the right thing to do.
Like it flows from a deep, intuitive understanding.
Precisely. But even within Neo-Confucianism, you have dissenting voices. Daizen, for instance, argued that even those who are very advanced morally still need to think things through, to consider the consequences of their actions.
So intuition is not enough.
Not entirely, according to Daizen.
It's really amazing to see how these later Confucians built on those classical ideas, how they adapted them to new intellectual currents while holding on to those core values.
It shows how dynamic and adaptable the tradition can be.